Welcome to a Pulp event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, since 1996, online at thepulp.net. This Pulp event podcast features Rick Lay, pulp historian and chronologist, discussing the 75th anniversary of the pulp character, the Avenger. The talk was recorded on August 7th, 2014, at PulpFest 2014 in Columbus, Ohio.
Originally, I wasn't supposed to do this presentation. This was going to be Will Murray, but for whatever reason, Will couldn't make it, though his research was invaluable to me in preparing this. But just as I am sort of the reluctant presenter, as you will see as we go through the history of the Avenger, I became the reluctant chronologist for him. Officially, totally out of the blue. Oops. Okay. Now, the Avenger grew as a combination of two pulp heroes, Doc Savage and the Shadow. Street and Smith decided to combine the two characters or concepts, characteristics of the two heroes into a new character called the Avenger. That decision happened around either late 1938 or early 1939. The man who dreamed it up was Henry W. Ralston, who at that time was the vice president at Street and Smith. He had been the business manager in the early 30s when the characters were first conceived. Now, they had then a conference of three writers. The man on the right is Lester Dent, who, as Kenneth Robeson, was writing Doc Savage primarily, even though there were other writers who were involved with Doc Savage. He was the original writer and the primary author of the series. The gentleman on the left is Walter Gibson, who, of course, was the author of the Shadow novels. And in the middle, you see Paul Ernst, who had done work as a horror writer for Weird Tales, and had also written some detective stories. And he came up as the character of the Avenger, fleshed him out. And for those of you who don't know the Avenger, I'm just going to briefly summarize what the character is, and then we're going to trace all the influences on him. The Avenger is a man named Richard Henry Benson. Now, he is in his 30s when the novels begin. He is married with a young daughter. He had lived an incredibly adventurous life and had traveled all over the world. Somehow, he has abilities akin to Doc Savage, but we never learn how. He is the greatest Renaissance man since Leonardo da Vinci, or Clark Savage Jr. And he decides to take an airplane flight because his wife's mother, I think she's extremely ill. That was the explanation. And she lived in Canada, he was in the United States. And on the flight, he decides to go to the bathroom. It's to wash his hands, because you couldn't say why people went to the bathroom for the real reasons in those days. And when he comes out, his wife and daughter have disappeared, and everybody claims they were never on the plane. Now, we later discover they've been murdered. But this whole shock of this happening to him causes his hair to turn white and his facial muscles to be paralyzed. And this flies in the face of science, but supposedly if your facial muscles become paralyzed, you are suddenly like Plastic Man and can shape your face into anything possible. So he now has the ability to become a super master of disguise. And He then uses his vast, well, he sets himself up in publicly as a crime fighter in an organization called Justice Incorporated. Now, Ernst's background in detective fiction influences characteristics of the Avenger. There is an excellent collection by Altus Press called CK and Other Prototypes of the Avenger by Paul Ernst, and there's an excellent introduction by Will Murray. And it mentions several characters, but we'll later allude to some of them elsewhere in the presentation. But the one we're going to concentrate right now is a character called the Wraith. And the Wraith was created in 1936 for detective tales. And he was a one-shot character, even though he had this incredible potential to go on for his whole series of adventures. And the Wraith is a man named Perry Westbrook, who is in a train accident, and his face gets messed up. And essentially, he has the same face that Two-Face has in the Batman comics. Half of it's very pleasant, and half of it's mean and ugly and twisted downward at the end. But he also gets this facial paralysis that the Avenger, or Benson, would later get. And he discovers that he can mold his face. So what he decides to do is he's going to make the happy, both sides match the happy, pleasant face when he's Perry Westbrook, and when he's the Wraith, he'll make it mean and ugly. Now, the other things that pop up, the Avenger will have two special weapons. They'll have a gun named Mike, which is a .22 caliber pistol with a very thin barrel, that which he would shoot and knock out guys by creasing their skulls. And he also has a knife called Ike, and he would strap these to his ankles. You see the forerunner of both weapons in the Wraith. The Wraith has a pipe-like gun that he straps to his knee, and he doesn't care about not taking life. He'll kill crooks in any way he wants. And it's button operated, so it's under his pants. So if he's sitting like this towards the crook and taps his knee, he's just shot him in the heart. And then he just had a simple throwing knife. Now, the other sort of famous character that Ernst created just to get his pulp credentials out of the way, when he was writing for Weird Tales, he got drafted to write a character that the editor Farnsworth Wright was very enthusiastic about, but it really didn't catch on, called Dr. Satan. It was this incredible master criminal who used black magic to commit crimes. He really doesn't influence the Avenger, but you see in some of the villains, like in the Black Death and in novels like the Black Death and the Blood Ring, where they pretend to do supernatural crimes, the sort of like the descendants of Dr. Satan, except they're phony magicians. Now, the name Richard Henry Benson was largely inspired by Henry W. Ralston, and it comes from Richard Henry Savage, who was an engineer, an author, something of an explorer, who lived in the late 19th century, died in 1903 in a rather tragic traffic accident. A horseless carriage ran him down where he was crossing the street. And Ralston had known him, and the name Doc Savage came from the savage part. So the Richard Henry came from the first part of his name. Now, this decision to combine elements of Avenger, of Doc Savage and the Shadow, had actually been done before by a competitor, and that was Secret Agent X was the character who was created, who was published between 1934 and 1939, and as we will see, the Avenger is basically Doc Savage. It's even published under the name Kenneth Robeson, which was Lester Dent's alias, with some elements of the Shadow. And they don't use as much as the Shadow as you thought they should, or maybe they could have, might be a better way to phrase it. And that reason, I think, happened because of Secret Agent X. Secret Agent X was a copy of the Shadow, was a lot of little characteristics of Doc Savage. Secret Agent X operated as a vigilante. He, like the Shadow, he's a World War I spy. Like the Shadow, he's a master of disguise, master of makeup. He's got agents positioned in different parts of society. He's got established cover identities. That's the Shadow part. The Avenger part is, let's throw in a commitment not to take human life. Let's throw in non-lethal weaponry, sleep gas devices and things. So you then have a combination of the two Street and Smith heroes, but the emphasis is more on the Shadow. So if you're going to do that again, you got to go the other way. Now, when I was looking at this, I was looking at the timing of these decisions to create the Avenger. The Avenger, Paul Ernst submits the first manuscript, ironically, in February 1939, which is when the last issue of Secret Agent X, dated March 1939, hits the newsstand, which is an intriguing irony. And I don't know, I was wondering, had Ralston heard that this magazine was dying out? And maybe he said, right, our competitors have successfully combined the two characters. Let's do it now. And now that they no longer have a combination character, let's make one of our own. Certainly Secret Agent X influenced it, whether they knew he was being terminated and that affected the creation of the Avenger, I have no idea. Now, the concept of the rubber face actually originated in 1910 in a popular detective called Cleek and the 40 Faces, who was created by Thomas Hanshew. And Cleek was a Scotland Yard, let me correct it. Cleek was a burglar in London, England, sort of a Raffles type, who decides to reform and join Scotland Yard. Now, he has this incredible rubber-like face that he was born with. By today's standards, he would be a superhero mutant. Now, the explanation for how he gets this ability makes no sense. We didn't have radiation, or at least, well, actually, we probably did have radiation. Madame Curie was experimenting. They weren't smart enough Thomas Hanshew wasn't smart enough to come up with radiation as with the explanation. He just said Cleek's mother was playing around with a rubber doll when she was pregnant. So somehow you get mutant children who can twist their faces in anything possible. Now, you may wonder, what does Leslie Charteris's The Saint have to do with the Avenger? Now, if you're my age, I was born in 1955, you know The Saint from Roger Moore in the 60s, and he travels around the world, and he's a cosmopolitan adventurer. But The Saint goes back to, The Saint went through different phases. What you saw, if you saw the Roger Moore TV series, you saw the post-World War II version of The Saint. The pre-World War I version is very different. The same was created in 1928 by Leslie Charteris. And the original version was more like the Spider. The saint was a vigilante who killed crooks. Instead of marking him with a red spider, he left a little sheet of paper with a stick figure and a halo, or wrote it on the wall or something. And he had his favorite weapon, which you never saw on the TV show, were two throwing knives called Anna and Belle that he strapped to his wrists, though there were occasions where he wore them on his ankle. Now, even though we saw the Avengers' weaponry foreshadowed in Ernst's own detective, The Wraith, the knife idea and having these hidden sheaths or holsters may have come from the Saint originally. Now, the concept of vengeance was important in creating the Avenger, and nearly every pulp hero somehow dates back to Alexander Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo, a man who creates a new identity after he's unjustly imprisoned. But Walter Gibson, when he was asked how much did he influence the Avenger, he said, originally I didn't think that there was too much of the shadow in the Avenger, but Gibson then said, I wrote this novel called Vengeance is Mine, which was published in 1937, which is about a man who's victimized by criminals and decides to get back. But unlike the Avenger, he doesn't draw the line at taking human life, and eventually becomes as bad as a criminal himself, and the Shadow has to take him out. And Gibson believes that influenced Ralston. Now, Ernst had created another character, which is in the CK collection that I mentioned earlier, who was another one-shot character who could have had a pulp series of his own, called Old Stoneface. He was in a story called I Am Their Executioner. And Old Stoneface, it was written around, I think, 37. Old Stoneface is an FBI agent whose wife gets killed, and he becomes very vicious and vindictive towards criminals. But since he's an FBI agent, he can kill them pretty much and not get any trouble with the police. So then we have all the ingredients for Justice Incorporated. And here we have both the cover by H. Winfield Scott and my favorite interior illustration of the Avenger. Now, one thing about the Avenger, the way he dressed in the pulps, he just wore gray suits. So he would wear a gray shirt, a gray tie, a gray jacket, maybe a gray vest, gray pants. As we're going to later see, we have a different, currently artistic conception of the Avenger. The gray aspect of the Avenger is foreshadowed by another character that Ernst had created around 37 called Tom Dixon, who was in a story called A Case for the Gray Marauder, but I was at least browsing through it, and I don't think he's ever called the Gray Marauder in the story. But he has another identity where he fights crime, and he always dresses in gray. In the first novel, the Avenger picks up two aides. Fergus McMurdy, who's a pharmacist and chemist, whose wife and child were killed by criminals, so his history somewhat mimics the Avenger. And then we have Smitty, who is a brilliant engineer. His full name is Algernon Heathcott Smith. And he's, besides being a brilliant technician, he is huge physically and can beat the heck out of like 3 different guys at once. Now, he has a little interesting history because he really wasn't supposed to be Caucasian. The original Smitty was based on the character you see on the right, who's Jericho Druk, who was in the Shadow and was primarily the brawn of the Shadow's agents. But if you read this novels carefully, he was actually a pretty smart guy who could went on some very difficult undercover missions for the Shadow, but that seemed to get lost in the novels. So it looked like Smitty, and we see this in the interior art of the early Avenger novels, was originally supposed to be black. And for some reasons that are unknown, at the last minute they said we're not going to go that way. Maybe they thought it would be too similar to Jericho or whatever. Now in the second novel, The Yellow Horde, the Avenger gets, even though he's wealthy and has made money several times over, crime fighting is expensive. So in order to fund all these operations that he's doing, they have him discover a hidden cache of Aztec gold in Mexico. That idea may have come from H. Rider Haggard's 1893 novel Montezuma's Daughter, which is about an Englishman during the conquest who goes to Mexico during the conquest by Cortez and actually sees the Aztecs hide their gold in a hidden underground tomb. And you could speculate, if you're like many of the Wad Newton universe people such as myself, that what you're actually seeing is what the Avenger found in that novel. Now Haggard, the whole concept of gold and hidden gold by Indian tribes goes back to Doc Savage. We had the Mayan civilization, but the Mayan civilization also dates back to H. Rider Haggard. He wrote a novel called The Heart of the World in 1895, which had a city of gold in Guatemala, which was one of the influences on the fictional country of Hidalgo in Doc Savage. Now, ironically, we've seen that Smitty was originally supposed to be African American, and he becomes Caucasian. In a strange way, in the Yellow Horde, when we get the Avengers' female aide, Nellie Gray, she was originally African American. That's little known. But that's because of where the name was derived from. Nellie Gray was a popular song that was written in 1856 by a man named B.H. Hanby, and it's sung by a slave in the United States whose wife, Nellie Gray, has been taken away from him and sold to another slave owner. So that's where they got the Nellie Gray name from. So after having 2 characters who, at least in some way, were originally supposed to be African American, Paul Ernst finally gets apparently permission to do a true African American group of characters who are both a man and a woman, and that's Roosevelt and Josh Newton, who appear in the 3rd novel, and are 2 of the most innovative characters for the time in the pulps. They are graduates of Tuskegee University, and their role for the Avenger will be that they will often get jobs as servants in Caucasian households, and they would act the way whites expect black people to act, which unfortunately at the time was to be superstitious and not too bright. So this can be an intriguing commentary on racial affairs. but there's a little problem, unfortunately. The novel which they appeared in was the Skywalker, which they joined because their employer got murdered by criminals. The next novel was The Devil's Horn, and the Devil's Horns. And in that novel, they meet a black servant who is the racial stereotype. So it looked like early on, Street and Smith was sort of having it both ways. They were defying racial stereotypes, but catering to them at the same time. But after The Devil's Horns, that never happened again. So the presentation of the Newtons was exemplary from that point onward, or I should say, African Americans overall were represented well in the Avenger. Now, the Avenger apparently wasn't selling as well as Street and Smith liked. So they decided to do two radical things in the Avenger in around the 10th issue or so. And the first thing was the Avenger was going to get cured. He gets trapped in some chamber in an automobile factory and gets exposed to some weird sort of radiation. And his white hair becomes black again, and he brings up his facial muscles get restored. Now the photo on the left, or the interior drawing on the left, is not Richard Henry Benson. That's Cole Wilson, who is the man who cures the Avenger and now becomes one of his assistants. And Cole Wilson was sort of a young, energetic, heroic type who was almost a rival to the Avenger. And that will later affect the paperback presentation of the Avenger, as we will see. Now, the Avenger then, of course, is presented differently in pulp covers. He now has dark hair, starting with 3 gold crowns. But there was a little problem in this caused by this decision to change the Avenger. What frequently happened at Street and Smith, when they want to do something radically different, they juggle the novels. They say, let's push it up a little bit to increase sales. So there were 3 novels lurking in the archives where the Avenger still had white hair and the frozen facial muscles. So what they had to do was re-edit the novels to give him black hair, just have him use makeup to disguise himself. And Cole Wilson gets like a little explanation that he's off in Detroit conferring with the government or something. So there's an explanation why he's not in the novel. A similar thing happened in Doc Savage when they introduced the ape chemistry. So we suddenly learned later, he was in quarantine for all those months that you didn't see him. And the novel, the 3 novels on the earlier slide, it's House of Death, Nevlo, and Death in Slow Motion. Those were the ones that were all editorially changed. Now, the Avenger lasted for about 24 issues and ended in 1942. Some say it's due to the sales weren't as good as Street and Smith wanted. There was also talk that the paper shortage may have influenced the decision there. So, but they still tried to play around with the character by having it appear in Clues magazine. But this time, Kenneth Robeson became Emil C. Tepperman. Paul Ernst was out of the picture. Emil C. Tepperman had written Secret Agent X. He had done some Spiders. He did a series about Suicide Squad. and was known for pretty violent pulp novels. And when he started to do the short stories, he tried to remain at least faithful to the original concept of the Avenger as being a guy who used sleep gas or whatever to knock out criminals, wouldn't kill people. And the first two stories that he wrote, Death to the Avenger and A Coffin for the Avenger, are consistent at least with the original Ernst novels to that degree. You may think stylistically they're inferior. I kind of like The Coffin for the Avenger, just for the record, and it's sort of in the minority for that. But then a radical decision happened with the third story, A Vengeance on the Avenger, and I show here the cover for when it was reprinted in Robert Weinberg's fanzine Pulp. That's a Frank Hamilton drawing of the Avenger and Smitty. And in Vengeance on the Avenger, suddenly we see the Avenger killing people. And this isn't explicitly explained, but if you read it, you kind of have a hidden explanation. The whole story is about a man who Richard Henry Benson knew in South Africa years ago, had a chance to kill, didn't kill, and now he's coming back for vengeance and has captured all the Avengers' assistants and has really caused Benson to become upset. So it's sort of like he regrets not killing the guy, so he decides now he's going to kill criminals from now on. And that was reflected in the latest stories, but it looked like Tepperman was polishing off short stories that got rejected or the magazine folded before they were printed, and would rewrite them as Avenger stories. Because one of the stories is called Cargo of Doom, which has the Avenger battling Nazi spies before Pearl Harbor. And the second Avenger story, A Coffin for the Avenger, had the Avenger battling Nazi spies after Pearl Harbor. So you have this anomaly of one story where he's not killing people after Pearl Harbor, and a story where he is killing people before Pearl Harbor. So if you ever wanted to reconcile this, you got to say that he eventually, sometime after Pearl Harbor, decided he's going to go back to not killing people. Now, the Tepperman shorts lasted for a few while, and there were about 6 of them, I think, and then the character essentially vanished from the pulps. But he would get revived in paperback in 1970s. And what was most important about it was that Warner Paperback Library published it. And the reprints of the novels, what is important is the artistic representation of the Avenger. He now gets a uniform. Looks sort of like a chauffeur's uniform, or a little like Kato on the Green Hornet is what it always reminded me of. But that has become the standard artistic depiction of the Avenger from here on out. When they ran out of when they published the first 24 novels, they decided not to reprint the shorts in the paperbacks. And they hired a new writer, Ron Goulart, to write New Avengers, and he wrote 12 in all. Starting with The Man from Atlantis. And his Avenger novels aren't really true to the spirit of the pulps. They kind of read like TV shows from the 60s and 70s. In fact, if you took it was like if you took the Man from Uncle, made Justice Incorporated Uncle, made Thrush Nazi spies, you would have pretty much your typical Avenger novel by Ron Goulart. So you see a lot of things from TV in Ron's stuff. But he did introduce some interesting little in-jokes and innovations. For instance, one of the novels is called The Purple Zombie, which is set in Hollywood. And besides having a cameo by Lamont Cranston, who's, whether this is the real Lamont Cranston or the shadow impersonating Lamont Cranston is never explained, and also having a crazed science fiction fan named F.J. Ackleroyd, who's Forrest J. Ackerman under another name. The Purple Zombie is a movie that is being made by the studio, and it's derived from a comic strip done by Tark Mills, the creator of Miss Fury, the Purple Zombie, even though they never allude to that. I didn't find this out till many years later. I just thought they called it the Purple Zombie because that was a cool name of its own creation. But another thing that Goulart did that was kind of funny was he was going to the predecessor to PulpFest, PulpCon, and meeting all these pulp collectors. So we decided to include characters with the names of noted pulp collectors or authorities in the stories. So Bob Weinberg, who is an author in his own rights, ends up as a chief of police in a novel called Red Moon. In a novel called Black Chariots, Nick Carr, who's probably the greatest expert on Operator 5 and G8, ends up lending a car to somebody who gets killed by a flying saucer. And perhaps the most shocking revelation of all involved Don Hutchinson in The Iron Skull. If we believe this novel, Don was a Nazi spy in 1944. Maybe he was really undercover since he's still around, working for Allied intelligence. That's my theory. But the Iron Skull was Goulart's attempt to create a nemesis, a recurring enemy for the Avenger, because we hadn't had any villains who really came back. Tepperman in some of his shorts had some bad guy who would pop up and say that the Avenger had fought him before, but that was like the only time you were seeing him in the story. And the Iron Skull was sort of a cyborg villain. The novel involving him was published in 1975. That's 2 years after the $6 Million Man appeared on television. And he's a little like the $6 Million Man in that he has a robotic arm, and it's more robotic than bionic, if you remember how the $6 Million Man is set up, and a leg. So he's part metal and part flesh. Part of his face is metal. And even though the $6 Million Man may have been the logical inspiration for this, there's another character from television who origins actually go back to the Pulps, who sort of was the forerunner of the Iron Skull. Now, there was a writer named Steve Fisher who created many pulp heroes, created some aviation pulp heroes. He also created a character named Sheridan Doom, who was the backup feature for the Shadow in the 1930s. And Sheridan Doom was a naval officer in the U.S. Military who's in an explosion, gets his face totally disfigured, but they don't put any metal in it or whatever, but his chest is severely damaged, so he gets these metal plates which make him almost impervious to bullets. And there was a show that began in 1965 called The Wild Wild West. And in January 1966, they aired an episode called The Night of the Steel Assassin. And the Steel Assassin is a character named Torres. And there were two writers involved. Fisher wrote an outline, and then they gave it to another writer named Calvin Clements to expand upon. And Torres was sort of Sheridan Doom gone evil. He's an American officer who gets blown up. Through his own genius, he somehow he supervises an operation where his flesh gets merged with metal. And he's this somewhat half-robotic, half-human villain. And I think that was probably where Ron Gulick got most of the Iron Skull from. Now, the series got canceled, and we had some loose ends. First of all, the Iron Skull's still running around. Second, there was a novel called The Glass Man where the Avenger fought an invisible man, and there was a Nazi spy named Werner Conrad, who was sort of a evil master of disguise, sort of a German version of Lon Chaney Sr., who now works for Hitler as a spy. He's also still at large, never got brought to justice. And at the end of the last novel, Demon Island, what Goulart liked to do was insert a little opening for the next novel in each novel as it ended, sort of what they used to do in Doc Savage and The Shadow. And he suddenly has the Avenger receive word that his wife and child are alive somewhere. And it gradually leaked out that there were going to be robots created by the Iron Skull. Well, as you will see, we will eventually get one of these loose ends resolved. Two will still remain unresolved. Now, when in the interim, when there are no new Avenger stories getting written, we get some parodies of the Avenger by Philip Jose Farmer. And one of these is in a series called Great Heart Silver, which began in 1975, and the story is called Great Heart Silver in Shootout, or Showdown at Shootout is the title. And in that story, there are parodies of every pulp hero from the 1930s, and they go to this town in the West, and they end up killing each other, and they're mainly fighting Herr Dr. Kluger from G8. But you have a character who's supposed to be the Avenger, and he's called the Punisher. Now, in case you're wondering if that had any connection to the Marvel character, the Punisher had appeared 2 years. The story was published in 1935. 1973 is when the Punisher appeared in The Amazing Spider-Man, but he was just a supporting character then. He didn't get his own magazine until years later. So Farmer was probably totally unaware that there was a Marvel character with that name. The other story that Philip Jose Farmer did that was a parody of the Avenger was a story called Savage Shadow, which is a story in which Kenneth Robeson is not Lester Dent, is not Paul Ernst, but it's Kenneth Robeson. The story pretends that there really was a writer named Kenneth Robeson who used his real name and wrote all these novels. And in Savage Shadows, which you can find in the Farmer collection, Pearls from Peoria, the Robeson meets real-life Peefbull, who he bases supposedly the Shadow and the Avenger on. So Doc Savage and the Shadow, and Doc Savage and the Avenger on. And Doc Savage is supposedly based on a drunken veterinarian. And the Avenger is based on some crazy mafia guy who's called the Vindictive One, or or the Avengeful or something, whose family gets wiped out by rival gangsters and is out to kill all the other mafia guys. Now, Lynn Carter in the 70s began a series called Prince Zargon, which was sort of a variation on Doc Savage, a Doc Savage-like hero. And he would have various pulp, even though the stories were set in the 70s, Carter would have pulp heroes from the 30s make cameos. And his favorite little device was to have Prince Zargon go to the Cobalt Club from the Shadow, and there are all these members there who are Richard Wentworth, Lamont Cranston. You get Bruce Wayne as Batman, or Batman as Bruce Wayne. And in one of them, the Volcano Ogre, you have Richard Henry Benson in the Cobalt Club. But what's interesting about Benson is his face is now back to being paralyzed. And this led to some speculation in fandom that the Avenger somehow went into a relapse and went back to the way he originally had been. There's another Prince Zargon novel called The Earthshaker, in which all the heroines from the Pulp series are hanging out together. So Nellie Gray is hanging out with Margot Lane and Pat Savage. Now, the best reference book on the Avenger is called The Grey Nemesis. It was written by the late, great Howard Hopkins, who unfortunately passed away a few years back. And that, if you want to read a reference book on the Avenger, this is the book. It originally popped up in a fanzine. The earliest version of it appeared in a fanzine that Howard was self-publishing called Golden Perils in 1985. Now, he revised it twice. I think the last revision was 2004. And this became the basis for a new Avenger series done by Moonstone Books. So we have the Avenger Chronicles and the Justice Incorporated files were the first two books. I'm showing the hardcover versions of those. And this is when I start to get involved. I used to write articles in imitation of Philip Jose Farmer for pulp fandom in the 80s and 90s. And I was doing chronologies for various characters, Doc Savage, The Shadow, The Avenger, a lot of other people. And I had done one for, it was Echoes, which was then published by Tom Johnson, called A Chronology for the Avenger, which ended up being reprinted in Daring Adventurers by Altus Press, which was a collection of my articles. And I read the Avenger Chronicle, which was edited then by Joe Gentili with Howard Hopkins. And I immediately noticed that as far as Howard was concerned, he wasn't worried about consistency. He was treating this like a Sherlock Holmes anthology, meaning you have to be consistent with Ernst. He really wasn't worried about Goulart and Tepperman. He thought they were inferior to Ernst. If you read The Grey Nemesis, that's very clear. In fact, he would totally throw out the Tepperman stories. He treats the Tepperman stories the way Shadow fans Street, the Bruce Elliott stories. And he didn't, they had there the concept that the Avenger suffers a relapse and has his facial muscles paralyzed again. But they would publish one story where they actually have that accident in November 1941. And then they had a sequel to by Ron Goulart called Return of the Iron Skull to Demon Island, in which the Iron Skull comes back. And we see these robots that are supposed to be, that are posing as Benson's wife and child, resolving that loose end, but the Iron Skull still gets away, so we still have a loose end. And that story's taking place like 1945. So I looked at it and I said, there's no way you can make chronological sense about this. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to let my original article stand and never again involve myself with the Avenger. I get an email out of the blue from Win Scott Eckert, who's one of the authors in these anthologies, saying Joe Gentili wants a chronology of the Avenger. Would you like to do it? But by the way, now normally when I get chronologies, I'm a law unto myself and I do whatever I want to do. Here are the restrictions Joe is placing on you. First of all, you can only have him, you have to have 3 periods, one where his face is frozen the first time, one where it's not frozen, one where it gets frozen again. You can't have him going through relapses back and forth. And the other one was all the Tepperman stories have to kind of take place together, because Howard Hopkins hates them. Oh. And he wants it so you can say that they're not legitimate and you can ignore them. He doesn't want them intermixed with everybody. So I said, okay, I'll do this. But you know, you've got this problem that you got Goulart from 1942 to 1945 has the Avenger without a frozen face, and suddenly you have this story which takes place in November 1941 where the accident happens which causes the relapse. So I had to come up with an explanation that it was a delayed reaction to this explosion. I'm not going to bore you with all the little gyrations I had to go in. I did cheat a little bit. His face does flip back and forth in a few entries in there. But that's how I became the chronologist for the Avenger, officially licensed by Condé Nast. But personally, I wanted to wash my hands of the whole thing, to be honest. But it's I had to override sometimes a lot of references and stories to when they took place to make them fit into 3 distinct periods. Oop, I hit the wrong button. Okay. But the other thing that Moonstone did, they had a story that Michael Usland wrote. Who's, if you don't know who Michael Usland is, he's the producer of the Batman films. And as we shall see gradually in the comics, he has a long association with the Avenger, which is continuing to this day. And he did in the hardcover edition as a special feature, a story called The Green Hornet Meets the Avenger. Now, I didn't mention this earlier. Moonstone Books in their hardcovers always has extra little goodies. So if you want my chronology, you have to get the hardcover of the 3rd volume of The Avenger, the Roaring Heart of the Crucible. You get the paperback, you're not going to get the chronology. And in this story, it's a pretty decent story where the Green Hornet, the Avenger is high, because it's a Green Hornet. If you know the Green Hornet, he's supposed to be a crook when he's actually a crime fighter. And the Avenger is sort of brought into Detroit to track down the Green Hornet and gradually he realizes the Green Hornet is a crime fighter like himself. Now we come to the most interesting little innovation concerning the Avenger. If you're a fan of new pulp fiction, you would be aware of the existence of a character named Sun Ko, who is actually a Nazi version of Doc Savage, created in Hitler's Germany, was very popular in the 30s, was not known to any of us except the fellow named Jess Nevins, wrote about the Sun Co series on a website called Pulp Heroes. And a fellow who I'm looking at right now named Art Seppo decided to write a collection of Sun Co stories, not based on this, they're totally new, they're not consistent with the original German. They use.
Gotta close it up.
Yeah, okay, I got
Farmer Kyle.
Okay. So, Sun Co became a novel by Art, became a book by Art, and that at this point every new pulp writer has used Sun Co as a villain in their writings, and he's scheduled to fight the Avenger in a Moonstone, in a novel published by Moonstone, written by Matthew Barr. Now, I'm briefly just going to mention the radio and comic book versions of the Avenger. First, there was a 1942 series about the Avenger where he was Richard Henry Benson, which is largely an adaptation of the pulp novels. In 1945-46, there was a different Avenger series where he was a character named James Brandon, who was essentially a rip-off of the Shadow, in that he could make himself invisible, but he did it by swallowing capsules. In DC Comics in 1975 did a short-lived Justice Incorporated series. Jack Kirby did issues 2 through 4, and they were doing the Shadow at the same time, and Michael Uslan wrote a story where he fought the Shadow. And then DC did some controversial concepts, some controversial adaptations of the Avenger. One was called Justice Incorporated in 1989. It was a 2-shot in which the Avenger ends up, I think, killing Nellie Gray. And then we had the controversial First Wave series in which the Avenger became a killer, like he was an Emil Tepperman, more like the Marvel superhero The Punisher. But the big news is Michael Usland is doing a comic book called Justice Incorporated, in which the Shadow, the Doc Savage, and the Avenger would meet for the first time in the comics. And it's going to be coming out this month, and from the summaries I've read, it seems to be a revised origin of the Avenger in which Doc Savage and the Shadow play a direct role in his creation. And that is the conclusion to the history of the Avenger.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the Pulp Net. When your next adventure was just a dime away. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps.